see it.
Just bear with me.
Yeah. Okay, check.
Does that come through okay?
Yeah, it does.
Do you want me to make a start?
Yeah, I think we should. I mean, Cliff is not back, but I think we should make a start just because I'm conscious of time.
Excellent. Okay. Well, I'll try and keep it well within the 20 minutes that was allowed. So thanks very much for allowing me to present on the some of the thoughts and ideas coming from the UK side of the data collection process. So this really is a very brief summary of some of the key findings associated and the reflections associated with the paper that Lauren referred to that was published in Town Planning Review on the UK academics and practitioners' perspective on internationalisation. And just as a personal note, I felt really energised and engaged with this, and I really learnt a great deal from it in connecting with what Stuart was mentioning there about having the opportunity to reflect and learn about different international debates in ways that I probably hadn't really considered as deeply as I perhaps ought to have done in my sort of formative academic career. So that, in that sense, it was a really great experience from that. So some of the key issues that inform the development of the paper, there is, I think, as already touched on, a need for increasing numbers of professional planners that are more attuned to the international debates affecting urban and regional spaces, particularly around housing, health, infrastructure, and some human-induced and natural problems, disasters perhaps. And also there are wider geographical and planning debates raging about hypermobility and planning in an era of globalization and the collapsing of spatial scales and how the global and local interact, and these kind of debates have been raging for a long time. So all these are pertinent, I think, to the debate about how can planning practice respond in an era of purported globalization where scale is being reworked constantly on a regular basis, according to some of these. And of course, we also know, and we've also talked about the fact that internationalization is increasing and there's a greater transference of international ideas and exchange of ideas across time and space, which creates challenges and opportunities. But within all that, I think there are certain doubts coming from internally within the team, and also from what we read and reflect on. I think there's doubts about whether or not internationalization is being sufficiently embedded and reflected in planning curricula and practice to a degree, and whether or not the future practitioners that are coming through the HE education system are being sufficiently given the skills, knowledge to deal effectively with these internationally recognized challenges that we've kind of discussed. So intuitively, we know that these issues are there, but we wanted to find out really from the practitioners and the educators about whether or not these issues are really apparent and what can we do about them in simple terms. So data, I don't want to go over this too much because it's already been covered, but Lorena and Lauren and myself are involved in this, but we wanted to speak directly to those planning educators about their experiences of dealing with internationalization and these global international debates and how it was shaping UK planning curricula. But we also didn't want to just leave it there. We wanted to find out a little bit about how practitioners felt regarding the internationalization debate. So we sent out a survey, and the RTPI were very supportive and helpful in this, in facilitating the survey out to practitioners. So those two data sources combined, I think, gave us a really good understanding of the issues, albeit in we perhaps could have done more, maybe on the UK planning educators side, but we did try to capture a range of views, certainly from the academics, not just those at the kind of Russell Group institutions, but also some of the respondents came from the newer universities and the different, tried to capture the stratification of UK higher education, so sort of kind of reflecting the different challenges across planning education in the UK as far as was practicable. And yes, so in terms of the results, yeah, respondents were generally positive about recent efforts to embed and engage with more global discourse about planning, particularly around the big challenges, climate change, urban pressures, development pressures in different parts of the world. And the respondents, both practitioners and the educators, talk openly and positively, I think, about the way in which these debates could inform and enrich particular modules, and then how that might feed into assessments and therefore broaden the overall educational experience, and hopefully deepen students' knowledge of these debates, which is all great and all good, I think. And one particular obvious point, perhaps, the value of international case studies, but also UK case studies in wherever possible and well designed, came through very positively as real vehicles for fomenting that kind of exchange of interesting perspectives on global issues. So here was a nice quote from one interviewee about how we took students to overseas field visits. They know how they approach people. They learn to be a bit more open, rather than about this kind of sensory dimension of engaging out in field work, learning about different contexts, different planning debates, but not just about how to write and apply policy. So I thought that was quite interesting there in that respect. We also unpicked some of the tensions associated with trying to embed internationalization in a more fulsome way. And these are common themes, I think, that have been picked up in the literature previously, but were reaffirmed in the data collection. This idea about student education, student recruitment versus different educational and professional priorities, where the balance lies there, I think. Some educators were saying, well, radical wholesale or decolonial approaches to radically reshaping the program was not absolutely necessary, because it didn't necessarily fit with the course and program that they were delivering and marketing and selling and recruiting quite successfully. So they couldn't really see the value as such in radical change for the sake of it, because that would work against them in many respects. And this idea of the very practical challenges of trying to accommodate and celebrate increasingly diverse voices that come into the classroom from different geographical contexts, that come onto UK courses from other parts of the world. How do we bring out that knowledge, those experiences, into classroom settings that maybe have been very traditionally UK focused topics and modules, when staff have to deal with the practicalities of large student numbers and finding mechanisms and ways to encourage and facilitate exchange is sometimes quite difficult, given the other priorities that shape education delivery. On the survey side, some experienced practitioners talked of how we could encourage a sense of acquisitiveness, a willingness to learn and listen from other contexts, but also this balance between breadth and depth, really, the extent to which you expose students to the wider geographically informed, interesting debates that shape places globally, against the contextual application of planning knowledge in place, where there are different laws, different customs, different cultures, different languages. So this balance between breadth and context was kind of interesting. So here's, for instance, coming from a survey, yeah, curiosity is an important skill, openness, also adaptability, seeing planning as you're not just learning the skills and knowledges now, right in this moment in situ, as it were, and connecting to the video earlier that we saw about how planning and this willingness to learn over time to develop and deepen your skills is very important, I think. And again, reflecting the need to strike the balance between breadth, but also how ideas apply in the context, policy objectives, and how they apply locally is seen by some as being an important point, I think, when delivering UK planning education, certainly from one practitioner at least. Certainly the RTPI, I think, is reflected in their learning outcomes and the overall framework that sets the backdrop in which planning education plays out, do acknowledge the need to assess and experience spatial planning and encourage students to reflect on that, how it plays out in different contexts and spatial scales. But some respondents, at least to our data collection exercise for our study, suggested that there's also opportunities to further reflect on the historical imprint of colonial ideas and Western planning principles and how they apply to different contexts, but also how they continue to shape contemporary decision-making, contextual forces and factors that influence and shape everyday planning practice. So I thought that was quite an interesting aspect of the research. So here is a nice quote from one respondent saying that yes, people come wanting to learn about UK or British planning education, seeing it and somehow seeing it as being perhaps superior in some instances, but as this respondent made clear, try to convey to students a need to question some of the stuff that you're about to hear about regarding British planning policy and the transfer of knowledge at different scales and at different historical periods. I think that's kind of important there. How it's rooted in a colonial experience. Likewise, from another respondent, this idea of understanding the history and the background of the profession and where it came from. So it's not just looking at the surface or the contemporaneous context in which planning plays out, but digging deeper and understanding something about the historical evolution and how these approaches apply in different spaces, I think is important. One other area of interest, I think, was this idea of how customs and forms of exchange that take place in cities in parts of the global north, in those diasporic communities, are important to understand those forces, I think, as a way into kind of understanding how places change in parts of the global north, rather than simply seeing urban space as being shaped in the main by powerful developers and compliant planners and relaxed planning frameworks which allow development to unfurl, but also get planners, UK-based planners and the international students that come onto the UK planning programs to understand how those communities in parts of the global north function, and the skills and knowledge and approaches to understanding how those communities function was also mentioned as being a potentially interesting dynamic of this whole internationalization debate, which might be a way in to almost soften the general view that places are sort of inevitably shaped by the power of economic forces alone. I thought it was interesting. So this idea of thinking about the power dynamics, the solutions in different communities, and question what's informal and illegal in the British, what might be considered kind of disorderly perhaps, or out of place, or not policy compliant or informal perhaps, but getting planners to think about how these communities function and the skills needed to understand how these communities function and the businesses function and these forms of exchange, which may not naturally conform to ideas that codified in standard British practice, as it were. So just some further reflection, just to finish off. I will be short. Yep, this idea about strengthening research, we've already touched on this. Curriculum design might increase students' preparedness for different geographical debates. There's still this tension that exists, I think, between this drive towards pure internationalization against locally focused, the professional accredited education, and the need to sell programs to appeal to lucrative markets. Yep. Something that came through the interviews, I think, is about trying to manage the different resources needed to sustain internationalization in ways that benefit different people. I think that's an important point. Yep, still this idea of we need to provide the necessary skills to deliver global solutions. Still a bit of ambiguity there about what precisely are those skills and what precisely is the knowledge that's needed, I think. But this idea of aligning international marketing with recruitment and support systems, different elements that go into making internationalization work, I think in the UK there are other forces outside of the course level, at kind of institutional level, that need to perhaps be balanced and come into alignment to ensure that internationalization can flourish at course level. And there's also an interesting thing here around the way in which students experience internationalization, both within the classroom setting and outside of the classroom setting. So there's perhaps some ideas about the future, perhaps thinking through ethnographic research, perhaps there, capturing the views of people as they experience internationalization beyond the more formal educational spaces, and what universities do to kind of encourage into kind of integration or the transference of international ideas beyond the formal teaching spaces, I think is kind of interesting. Last few, we've already touched on this, it's already been addressed really through the SAPER project, I think. This idea of more online, perhaps some sort of forum or fora to capture the views of students, practitioners, to encourage that kind of institutional exchange across different time spaces, I think is really important. And I say one really interesting aspect of the outcomes of this SAFE project is building that platform. I know other platforms exist as well, but I think that's really powerful and potentially positive. Again, linked to that, this idea of expanding the number of resources, case studies, sharing of knowledge about how places are being reshaped by global forces. And also, I think this idea of trying to encourage students to reflect on how different diasporic communities function. I think that's really interesting. That's a way in to encourage some of our more reticent UK students, perhaps, to look more carefully at the cities that they're perhaps working in or have experience of, and seeing how, or finding ways and knowledge and skills to really tap in and draw out some of that that diverse knowledge base in a way that perhaps sits sort of outside of traditional views of how cities might function and evolve. So they're my very quick quick reflections, and I'm just about on time. So thanks very much for that. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. I'm conscious we have a question from Cliff, but I'm just wondering if we should hand over to Phil first, and then we'll take the time for the questions. And the other thing as well is I've been in touch with Stuart. I mean, we do have a bit of flexibility, so because I'm just conscious of time. So if we had to push slightly towards 1 p.m, I mean, that's an option. I'm not saying we will do it, but for those, if some of you have flexibility, that's something we could envisage, especially for the block 3 discussion. Anyhow, I'll just leave it to you, Phil, now. Phil?
Sorry, you want my question, yeah?
No, I was thinking we're taking your question after Phil's presentation.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, and I saw Werner has started actually to reply. So if some of the colleagues wants to put and to write a couple of answers, but I think, I mean, I like to talk rather than type. So I think it would be better if we discuss it a bit later afterwards. Phil?
Phil, I think you're muted at the moment.
Yeah, Phil, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I managed to share the screen, but I didn't manage to do the basic thing. How much is this about I've been doing this semester? Quite a lot, anyway.
And you're in the team.
Yeah, it's been a funny project to be involved in, a really cool project to be involved in. I mean, I'm very much a cultural geographer. I'm not a planner, and so when Stu was talking earlier about the sort of lesson learning, I think particularly his personal journey in terms of working with some UK scholars, thinking about UK ways of doing academia. It's been really joyful for me to work with the South Africa team, and particularly writing with Stu has been really exciting for me in terms of getting my head into planning as a discipline, which I've always been sort of on the fringes of with some of my work, but it's been really nice to actually get into that kind of mindset. But one of the problems, of course, is that I'm a cultural geographer, and one of the things that cultural geographers do is get really excited about theory. And theory, as came out of the sort of the participant interviews, really came out as a bit of a bogeyman for planners. In terms of saying, oh, you know, there's too much bloody theory in the program, and you know, that's no use. We need more practical skills, etc., etc. And I think that's, you know, been a sort of well-known thing within planning. And so here I am. You know, Lauren's brought me into this project partly because of, you know, tech things, and obviously it'd be lovely if you bought my new book about technology and methods. But also partly because, you know, I'm quite theory-led, and you know, it's kind of interesting that, you know, the idea of planning theory makes some academic planners kind of uncomfortable. So the idea of a cultural geographer coming in and saying, let's do some cultural geography theory with this really interesting material about planning is, you know, is potentially a bit controversial. And in some of the papers, some of the reviews papers that we've put together, you do sort of see some interesting things where some of the reviewers basically dismiss all the theoretical stuff and only engage with the kind of empirical material about South Africa, and just kind of, well, I don't care about the theory you put in. Why are you talking about that? You should be talking more about this empirical material. So it's, you know, it's been an interesting thing to kind of negotiate. Why do more theoretical material? Well, I mean, I think cultural geographers can be guilty of doing too much of it, absolutely. And it can be very self-indulgent, it can be very exclusionary. I mean, look at the title of this paper that, you know, Lauren, myself, Stuart and Lorena put together, Negotiating Polyvocal Strategies. I mean, come on, this is not very accessible. And it can be written in some ways as, you know, as ref bait, as things which we know are going to score well at ref because of the way it's framed. At its best, however, and even notwithstanding the title on this Andrews et al. Paper, I think this kind of theory can be a good opportunity to kind of zoom out from a case study to think about wider sociocultural processes, to actually use, you know, the case study that we're looking at here to speak back to theory and say, let's think about broader social processes which we can understand through the case study to read the theory back. And Lauren had kind of said, you know, can you have a chat about some of the abjection stuff? We haven't actually got a paper out on this yet. It's been to review, got some comments to respond to, but unfortunately the comments came back just as I was about to start teaching this term. So I was just like, yeah, that's a Christmas job. Why, you know, was I interested in exploring some ideas around abjection here? Well, partly because the basic ideas are fairly straightforward, although Julia Kristeva, who's on the right-hand side of the screen here, gets much more nuanced in the sort of the psychoanalytic literature that she uses. But actually the kind of core of what she talks about is pretty straightforward. It's very commonly used in kind of literary and artistic studies, and so geographers, planners actually could use this set of ideas more, I think. And it's been extensively used to look at the South African case, but not within questions around South African planning. So there's actually, there's quite a nice research gap there. Just a quick what it is. On one level, it's disgust. It's, leakage and ooze and stench of the body. That's not why it's interesting, though. It's interesting because when you get beyond this notion of, the disgusting, leaky, horrible body, it becomes about things which break the order of things which are seen as a threat to the established order. Christina talks about it as the in-between, the ambiguous, the composite. And that makes it a really handy metaphor for things which are seen as so troubling, they need to be contained or controlled. And of course, that then says, well, who gets to determine what is seen as problematic and what's disgusting and what needs to be contained and controlled? But it has really nice resonances with planning as a discipline because it has these qualities of how do we control space? This thing here is a problem, but if we move it over here, it's not a problem. So we should move it to a designated space. And, in some ways, you're talking about the essence of modernist planning there, where you take dirty industries and you shift them somewhere else so that residential areas, become a much nicer atmosphere, and you put, your polluting industries in another zone. And that kind of modernist impulse to kind of separate things out is not automatically a bad thing. And it plays into this notion of abjection, of separating out problematic elements to make life better in a different space. But it can be used in problematic ways. And that notion of that something is threatening because it is different to what we are saying is the norm has been around a very long time in in policies that are both in law and in fact. You go as far back as the sort of kicking out of the Huguenots from France in the 17th century. That okay, we don't want these horrible Protestants, we shall kick them out. And Charles II of England says, well, the French Huguenots can come and settle in England, but they kind of focus in Spitalfields because we'll keep them to a particular location. The more extreme example, of course, is the National Socialist in the 1930s saying that Jews are a contaminating other and must be spatially constrained, first in ghettos and then later in concentration camps. A less extreme version of this, but still with that notion of segregation, is the kind of restricted covenants and the white flight phenomenon that we see in the 20th century United States, which still has a continuing legacy of segregation in America today. And obviously, of course, while we're talking about this, is looking at the various formal and informal policies in South Africa leading to the Group Areas Act of 1950 and the establishment of apartheid, and that sense of we must spatially contain the threatening non-white body. And just sort of reflecting on what Lorena was saying about the data collection and the excellent work that she, Ruve and Mishka did there, it was a joy to work with the data sets. It was really easy to work with the data sets because of the quality of work that they've done. So kind of at the other end of the process, saying, oh, well, what interesting things can we take from this? And so just a quote on the screen here from an Afrikaans speaking planner who was talking about his very early on in his career where he's involved in what was apartheid planning and saying, well, what in some ways, what am I supposed to do? That was the job at the time. And the South African planning profession, prior to the end of apartheid was, almost required to create the spatial reality of the apartheid discourse. And so that when you get to 1994 or the 90s more generally, you end up in a situation where we've gone from saying non-white people are abject and need to be spatially segregated to a situation where the planning profession seems to be somewhat abject, or it's at the risk of becoming abject because it's out of line with the policy discourse which exists post-apartheid, post-94 in particular. And what's then very interesting is how the profession spends a huge amount of time and energy and effort refiguring itself to remove this sense that the planning profession is problematic, that it's potentially abject because it was complicit with the apartheid regime, partly by simply acknowledging that, the planning was involved with this as a profession, but much more significantly in the sort of 26 years since, massive diversification in the membership of planning as a profession and being really active in the attempts to overcome what we can rightly acknowledge a bit about being grotesque inequalities in South Africa. So that, rather than becoming abject, the profession has had a way back from that by positioning itself within the new political discourses of the nation. And sort of from a theoretical point of view, what's been quite interesting is that abjection is quite resilient. Things which have been labeled abjection under one set of circumstances can continue to be abject even when those circumstances and those policies change. So, after particularly after 94, non-white skin is no longer a legal basis for, saying that an entire group of people is abject, is problematic, and needs to be separated out. But poverty, continues to be racialized, and the constitutional commitment to a right to adequate housing, loads of new housing opportunities created in the sort of 25 years after 94, the latest stats that I've got here. But you still see an increase in informality over that period. And, you have people like Ivan Turek arguing that a lot of the new housing that's been built actually reinforces spatial segregation with the poorest trapped on the urban fringes. So that although you're no longer abject in law, the reality on the ground is that huge swathes of the population are still positioned as abject in wider society. Just kind of to reflect on, again, something Lorena was picking up at the huge diversity of South Africa as a nation, and obviously then the huge diversity of planning challenges, which again comes very strongly in the data set. That characteristics of both being global north and global south, asking questions about what the purpose of planning in South Africa is, because, you know, on one level it can be facilitating investment to drive economic growth. It can also be that active engagement with the poorest communities to enhance social justice. It can be both at once. And that tension within the profession is quite interesting to think about in terms of, you know, what is the role of the profession in driving out notions of abjection. A lot of that came out in the data sets around questions of eradicating informality. And I really I'm really interested in that tension between how we perceive informality in the global north and that kind of policy transfer of global northern models of planning into the global south, such that, you know, we labeled slum housing in the global north as being abject. By the 1970s, you know, we got rid of back-to-back housing in the UK. Those kinds of slum qualities, you know, the whole point was to eradicate them. That was the policy. And, you know, the kind of contrast to that then when you look at the South African context, I mean, there's loads of interesting, and you know, Stu was pushing me toward this in my reading, was that, you know, that kind of the backyard shack and the extensions in the newly formalized housing areas, you know, that kind of source of income survival strategy in the context of, you know, a very neoliberal economic inequality rather, so that there's no, you don't solve poverty by tearing down slum houses, because, you know, there's a structural poverty going on here. And so simply replacing the abject housing doesn't replace or doesn't solve the issues around, you know, how a large group of people are being labeled as abject and, you know, struggling to come to terms with that as a nation within policy. Why I got so interested in this is when you read Christeva, you know, when you put your theory hat on and read Christeva, she doesn't tell you. She tells you about abject status. She doesn't tell you how you come back from abject status. You know, how you know, move from being beyond the pale to within the pale, if you want to use that metaphor. Briefly, the South African planning profession was seen as somewhat problematic because of this association with the previous regime and manifesting the previous regime's policies. And then now, to a point now where it's sort of seen as just, you know, a fairly unremarkable part of the multicultural state. And you can make an argument that it's a middle-class profession. It's easier to come back from abject status. The profession simply adapts to a new way of doing business. But if you look at sort of, you know, in those terminologies, black-coloured Indian populations no longer abject in law, but we still have questions around spatial segregation. So abjection may no longer be a product of a legal framework, but the abjection of a whole bunch of a population is still there in practice. In terms of reflections here, you know, as a kind of cultural geographer, you know, I've in some ways I feel really uncomfortable writing about South Africa because I'm not an expert. But what's really interesting is how the South African case, and particularly the sort of South African planning case, allows us to think about how abjection as a process works. It allows us to speak back to the kind of theory that Christeva's writing in the early 1980s, and allows us to kind of go, well, that isn't enough to understand abjection. We can actually enhance our understanding of abjection through reading this case study. And for me, the really interesting thing is the path back from abjection is hard because abjection is resilient. The labeling of characteristics as being abject is highly resilient. This, you know, has obviously big significance beyond the South Africa case. You know, the way that we use land use zoning to exclude unwanted groups, we may ban discrimination, but we find subtle ways to make it happen. So we continue this labeling of abject in fact, if not in law. So just to wrap this up, this is my last slide, so, you know, don't panic. In the global South, there's, you know, been a very appropriate tradition of planners being concerned about sort of inappropriate use of ideas from the global North, how these ideas have been sort of transferred down without necessarily understanding context properly. And there's similar things within academia in terms of the way that we apply certain theoretical frames to different case studies, and whether that theoretical framing needs to be decolonized as well. For me, as a cultural geographer, the South African case has been fantastic because it's giving me insights into a theoretical frame which has come from the global north, and shows the limitations of that theoretical frame, allows us to speak back to that theoretical frame. But that, just in my closing thought is, there is still that discomfort in, are we taking a kind of a set of northern theories, extracting insights from a global south context in a kind of colonial mode to shed light on issues in the global north and theoretical issues in the global north? And that still leaves me a little bit uncomfortable in what we've done in terms of the theorizing, the sort of cultural theorizing of this material. Though, as I say, nonetheless, working with this data, working with this group of people has been such an eye-opening exercise and so exciting. I'm going to leave this here. So thanks everyone for listening to this rambling about cultural theory on an interdisciplinary tip.
Thank you very much, Phil, and thank you, David, as well. I think it's been brilliant to have your insights. So we have, I noticed already 2 questions. We have a question from Cliff and we have a question from Paul. Maybe you both want to say your question and then we can just pick this up afterwards.
Somebody's at the door. I've got to go and answer it. So take Paul first.
Okay, Paul.
Ironically, mine was a follow-on from what Cliff was saying. And it's more a comment. And in some ways it follows on from what Phil was just saying. Because one of the insights that's come from the project to me is absolutely applicable to what's happening in the UK at the moment in terms of the agenda around planning for diversity. It's being handled, I think, in a very simplistic and tokenistic way at the moment. But some of the issues that came out of David's paper or David's presentation about, I'm going to read from my briefing note at this stage because it's your briefing note from January, about the importance of collective memories, traditions, customs, and sense of place and attachment that manifests itself in many diasporic communities in parts of the global north, is an important lesson for people who take planning for diversity seriously to learn, and that's a great insight. From the stuff Phil was talking about one of the big issues is who defines what is abject, and that will have implications for whether planning is seen just as a mechanism for facilitating the operation of the market, mitigating its worst effect, or whether planning is there actually to lead positive change. From the strategic level and the local level is a crucial part of curriculum design, in my view. You have to understand what you're expected to do before you can define the skill set of how to do it. But it's actually, it brings it right back home to the area that Mike and I are living in at the moment. There's a lot of resistance to local authorities accommodating what is known as the Birmingham overspill, the amount of new homes that Birmingham can't provide within its administrative boundaries. And there are some technical arguments being put forward. And I've no evidence for this, so this is more polemic than anything else. But to me, there's a stench of racism about resisting people from Birmingham going to the wider outer areas, and the perception of what is abject, who recognizes it, who defines it, and then whether and how it's treated. I think there's a huge amount of lessons coming out of this for how planning practice is perceived and how it's delivered in the UK, and as well as for South Africa.
Thank you, Paul. Cliff and also Werner has been writing a lot in the comment box, and maybe accordingly afterward, maybe David and Phil, you want to respond a bit? Cliff?
Well, sorry about that. Yeah, there's a delivery at the door. Yeah, I started off by asking whether, the sort of colonial legacy within UK planning traditions was actually being taught. And I'm very conscious, where I'm coming from a little bit is what's happening here in Edinburgh at the moment, where where the whole issue of slavery and colonialism as a legacy in the physical environment is very much to the fore and very controversial. And as the chair of the major heritage group in Edinburgh, that very directly affects my position. But also I've gone on really, my last comment there is really, again, another thing that's happening in Edinburgh is picking up David's point that, that, you know, there's this dichotomous sort of choice between planning for economic growth and planning for social inclusion and social justice. And in the particular urban context of Edinburgh, which is an affluent city, historic environment, where traditionally a lot of the most wealthy have actually lived in the city centre and not on the fringe, what we're seeing is actually abjection is actually now being associated with aspects of neoliberalism in the sort of the extent to which the Council and Scottish Government has actually facilitated a series of developments around the city centre, not least linked to tourism, that are actually creating a backlash from the wealthy. So that there's, I think, you know, there's some cities where it's actually gone a stage further because the sheer strength of the neoliberal structures is so immense that it's now kind of consuming also the value that's there in areas which previously planning had a role in heritage protection in. Sorry, that's a bit rambling, and I could talk a lot longer, but I won't. Okay, I'll pass it over.
Okay. Verna, do you want to say a few words, and then David and Phil? And Clive as well.
Yeah, I've had a lot to say. I think that what Phil had to say about the objection in the South African context is very relevant, but it's also relevant in work that I've been doing with colleagues on book on urban geography in Zimbabwe. And there, two things came up very, very clearly. One is the inappropriateness of the laws that were only marginally changed after independence. And secondly, how those laws are being used against informal settlements, informal economies. And so I found that very, very interesting. The other comment I made is, it's one thing to say planners have a role to play, but planners work within an institution. And at the moment, many of our governance institutions are, you could say, bankrupt ethically, if not financially as well. And this is going to be a very interesting, it is an interesting challenge. It's a major challenge of working in an institution where you have a lot of ethical and financial challenges. So I think there could be a lot of interesting work to follow up on these two issues.
Thank you, Verna. Clive?
Yes, thank you very much. First, can I just begin by saying, as a non-academic, how sort of really inspiring I've found the presentations this morning, including the last two. It's really sort of fascinating stuff, and I'm proud and pleased to be part of this fantastic group of people. Just a few points from me. On the slide, I think David showed about entrance to the profession in South Africa. I mean, that growth of non-white entrance. I mean, should we not be seeing that as a real sort of positive step in terms of, you know, what, you know, the nature of the people coming into the profession, and seeing it as a something very positive for the future? That's the one point. Secondly, we in CAP have undertaken a survey of the planning profession across the Commonwealth, including research on planning education. And the issues that have been sort of explored here this morning and through this project are mirrored across many or most parts of the Commonwealth. So it is very much a sort of microcosm of what's happening on a global scale, I would say. And then the third point, I would just like to challenge, I think, David, when I think he said words to the effect that planning starts at sort of university. at the university level. I would say really that we need to look at how planning is dealt with, or issues that might not be called planning, but issues that relate to planning are dealt with at the school level. And I would suggest that you know, a really important sort of aspect of this would be to look at not just sort of higher education, further education, higher education, and so forth, but what happens at the other end of the educational sort of time zone, as it were, and what is taught about the kind of issues that we're talking about now, but in the context of primary schools and secondary schools, because I think that's where some of the seeds of the understanding we're trying to move on from are set amongst the minds of people. Thank you.
Thank you, Clive. Jo?
Yeah, I just have a couple of very brief points. I'd just like to say congratulations as well on carrying out such interesting work under these conditions. It's just been challenging for everyone. It's just really impressive. So well done. I just had a response to Lorena's really interesting presentation about the kind of practical considerations of carrying out fieldwork. I'd just like to encourage her, if she has time, to publish around that, because I think just the task of achieving what you achieved. I was really interested in the gender issue that you brought up, which I think is fascinating in a kind of patriarchal kind of context. But just the undertaking of doing this kind of international fieldwork, of being away from home, of having to kind of bring in kind of family considerations and stuff. I can think of many people that would be very interested to read about that. So it would be great if you find the time to kind of explore that in a publication. And then I just had a point for David, or really it is a question about the people you interviewed and what they actually, how they defined internationalization and the international, because I've done a bit of work on internationalization strategies in schools in England. And one of the things that we found was this kind of real confusion or contradiction or a lack of consensus as to what internationalization actually is. So I just wondered if you had any comments on that, really.
Thank you. So we have maybe David, Lorna, and Phil. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the comments and the feedback. It's really appreciated. And yeah, so on the internationalization, yes, I think there was a great deal of debate, and I don't think there was a particular consensus among the interviewees or the respondents necessarily about what internationalization meant exactly, although it could be broadly termed kind of increasing in a sense of international debates, global issues, and how they affect planners and planning frameworks and the like. But also other people took it to mean increasing in the number of international students and accommodating those different perspectives as part of the curricula as well. So yeah, I think that there's certainly something to follow up there about pinning it down or exploring that further. Yeah, I agree with Clive on the school level. I apologise, I probably didn't really phrase my explanation well enough there, but no, I'm also aware that there are initiatives underway to explore how planning is embedded at different levels of school education before people get on to higher education. And into formal planning education, but I was speaking more directly to our survey and the focus of our survey. But it'd be really interesting to follow that up with the examination boards, teachers, other contacts through education to see how planning and international planning ideas are influencing school curricula. That would be fascinating. That would be a really we could add that to the list of other things to consider maybe. And the last one, I think, on getting or finding ways to explore the legacies of colonial legacies and the imprint of Western incursions and how they play out in spaces of the global urban spaces of the global north. I think that's really interesting as well. That's something that came up in the question, and it just, I think for me it really opens, if done effectively and well, and some more thought I think is needed on looking at precisely which programs create the space for this kind of kind of discussion, but it really, I think, it helps perhaps softens some of the traditional planning histories that students get taught about the Chicago School, about dominant economic growth models, how they influence and shape the evolution of urban form. It really helps to open people's eyes. Actually, you know, the colonial legacy and how different communities really interact, and the different forms of exchange and linguistic skills and all that kind of softer, more tacit stuff that goes on under the surface, but it needs to be considered, I think, in more detail about how we can incorporate that into planning curriculum. I'm not sure anyone's really tackled that as yet. Not sort of across the board anyway. Across the kind of educational spectrum of UK planning courses as such. I mean, there will be pockets of really good practice where that does take place, and that came through in the interviews, I think, but maybe there is some further analysis that needs to be undertaken about where that might fit into the curricula and whether or not there's space. And again, as we talked about in the presentation, this tension between the need for professional accreditation. Students want the up-to-date knowledge to get them a job, to get them into employment, against the broader, more conceptual, potentially more interesting and engaging aspects of planning discourse that kind of perhaps fall by the wayside, perhaps in some instances, even though the RTPI's learning outcomes and general framework is fairly broad to allow for interpretation. I think there's certainly something there about the historical dimension as well as the spatial that probably needs to be looked at again in more depth. So yeah, some really interesting thoughts there. So thanks very much for that. I appreciate it.
Thank you, David. Lorena, quickly, and then Phil.
Yeah, so just as a comment to Joe's comment, thank you so much for the suggestion. And I think also it's an important reflection that we have to make. And I think that it would be really interesting to discuss not only about, of course, the field work, yeah, the positionality of me as an outsider within context that at some point, at some time, so familiar in a way. Yeah, I will really think about it because it sort of haunts me in a positive way. Maybe it's not the right word, haunts me, but yeah.
Thank you, Lorna. Before I pass over to you, Pat said she has a question. So Pat, over to you.
So I didn't mean to interrupt. I think
no, it's good. I want Phil essentially to conclude the block. That's why I'm leaving.
Okay.
That's why.
I just wanted to ask the question about the post-colonial frameworks. I'm sorry, this might be, it might have been dealt with. I had to go and deal with some students for an hour, so I've missed some elements. I'm sorry about that. So in terms of, because what David just said is quite interesting from that point of view, the sort of what are the kind of post-colonial discussions and the discussions about kind of diasporic communities in Britain and how they might have shaped the urban landscape. But it did occur to me that, I mean, at the beginning of Lauren's presentation this morning, there seemed to be a few moments where you were saying, so we were dealing with these post-colonial elements and then we had to do more of the technical stuff because we couldn't quite see how that would work its way through. And I if that happens in relation to a project like yours, which is wanting to deal with these post-colonial elements, the question that David raises about how you balance that with the kind of technical urge is, I guess, one that's, you know, it's just harder to imagine how people are going to balance that when they can't balance it on a project that sets out to look at post-colonial theory. So I'm just wondering whether there's going to be at any point a reflective piece or a piece that a piece of writing where you might think through what are the kind of pressures that make it quite difficult to make those post-colonial connections, to stay on that in a project like this, because I think that that's going to be quite helpful for quite a lot of people who are doing GCRF type projects, that there's going to be a lot of people who wanted to who set out to do all kinds of conceptual things and have ended up doing more kind of technical things. Not that there's no value in that, of course there is value in that, but it is interesting to see, you know, what are the pressures that make people not able to really engage fully in the end with some of those political and conceptual questions.
I'm probably just going to answer to this, but just very conscious that also it's recorded. So I'm just going to keep my answer quite broad. I mean, there's two things. I mean, Lorena did a lot of work and she actually conducted some specific colonial interviews. X had also, I mean, it includes planners, but it went beyond. So we have this, and essentially I push Lorena to this because this is a topic where Lorena essentially has been building upon already in her PhD. So she has the expertise. On our side, as per the project, we experienced quite a lot of an underlying question. We kept this as well with the view that we have data, and essentially Lorena, who has this expertise and also the engagement with regard to the South American, also post-colonial literature. So she has this and she can embrace this essentially. And this is essentially papers she's still working on. But on our side, essentially, we really also align with some of the other priorities, just because essentially it was, yeah, dealing with, let's say, political power relationship in higher education mainly.
Can I just say something about that? Because I do think that set of circumstances is really interesting, and it's something that's kind of at the base of GCRF as a kind of framing, the way that it sort of where it sends the money, for example, how it kind of determines certain power relations and makes it really quite difficult for people to talk from where they are about their situation. And I guess I still feel that a lot of that does need to be written up, and it needs to be kind of written up from within GCRF projects rather than, you know, sort of sniped from outside. It kind of needs to be reflected on, because you know, a lot of money is being spent across a lot of different projects and was spent very quickly, and there needs to be that moment of reflection at this point, I think.
Yeah. No, I fully agree. I mean, we can maybe have a separate discussion outside of any form of recording to discuss this further. Phil, shall I just hand it over to you for?
Sure, thanks, Lauren. I mean, I think what Pat's just raised sort of segues quite nicely into sort of where I'd begin with my reflections here. When coming at this, where Lauren had brought me into this project at quite a late stage in terms of the application process, saying, can you bring some expertise on this? I'm like, yeah, sure, no problem. Delighted to be involved. It's, you know, this sounds really cool. But I don't know anything about South Africa, and I've done no work on basically not even, you know, non-European context, non-UK context, frankly. Is, you know, a lot of work is UK based. So coming in with, you know, that very much the mindset of I can contribute very specific things, but in terms of the sort of the context that we're working in. And I kind of, when we went to South Africa on the sort of orientation trip, I mean, Pat and I had a chat about this when we got back, and I was kind of feeling very awkward and uncomfortable about why the hell am I involved with this? Because I don't feel like I'm bringing, it seems really patronizing in some ways, you know, GCRF as a sort of mechanism of, there's these fantastic scholars in South Africa who are doing this. What's the added value of me coming in to a project of this kind? And I don't have a good answer to that. What I will talk about, though, is the sort of the way that the sort of, you know, because I've been talking about the theory in that presentation, the sort of excitement at how theory moves around. And so I've been sort of reading stuff about abjection on and off for a few years. And in getting involved with the project in South Africa, you know, doing a bit of a lit review and going, well, there's loads of stuff that South African scholars have written, taking this body of theory, not people working in geography or planning, but, you know, other South African scholars have really engaged with this, because abjection is so focused on the extreme. It's focused on, you know, the absolute visceral disgust extreme, the absolutely beyond the pale, can't be redeemed. And so because of the way that apartheid was framed, you know, it has this real resonance, that language of abjection. But again, that sort of chat with Pat when I came back from our trip was like, you know, I knew there were extremes of wealth and poverty in South Africa, but actually seeing it face to face the first time, I found very emotionally challenging. I remember we was talking about that, Pat, and you were kind of going, yeah, because, you know, it's that difference between knowing a thing and feeling a thing. And so I was very humbled coming back from that trip. But what it also, and again, this was the chat Pat and I had, what it also made me think of, sure, but in the UK context, it's maybe not as visible, but there are still extremes here. And again, it's back to that point about the lessons that we draw from the South African case to illustrate things that may be more familiar to me in terms of the UK case. And that conversation about the Birmingham overspill and the kind of implicitly racialized or otherized language which underpins the objections to that Birmingham overspill. And so actually making you think, we're not so bloody smug in the UK, frankly, in terms of our legacy of really deeply problematic, and our continuing legacy of deeply problematic ethnic and racial divides. And I think that's been the thing that's been interesting for me, is to, okay, we're reflecting on the South Africa case, but actually that makes you really start to think hard about what's happening in your own backyard. And I think for me, as a non-South Africa specialist, that's been the really inspirational part of this project. And again, I'm genuinely inspirational. It's been working with, you know, Stu and Werner and others in South Africa in terms of, holy goodness me, the challenges being faced in that country and being faced up by planners and planning academics. You know, it is genuinely humbling to see, you know, to see what's happening and what's being done.
Thank you, Phil. What I should suggest is we just take a sort of 2-3 minutes break, and then I'll hand over to Stuart, and we can focus really on the South African results per se, with the idea that if everyone's fine, I mean, we can push beyond 12:30, so probably to 1 o'clock. So we can really spend time discussing the South African results more specifically. And also it may mean that we don't discuss that much block 3, but I think this is something, again, we can schedule sort of follow-up meetings as well. All right, so I mean, let's try to be back around 5 past this 3 minutes break. So very quick break, and we'll see you in a couple of minutes.